Relating and substantive first panel, which talks about the duality in Mexico and which features the problems of the non-traded sector. We're now going to turn to the issues of where Mexico and the U.S. are together, and in particular the issues of American manufacturing in Mexico, American manufacturing at home, and how investment from the U.S. into Mexican manufacturing has affected both economies, particularly the U.S. Jeff Schott, who's been senior fellow at the Institute for quite some time, and all of you know him as our guru on trade negotiations and free trade agreements, who of course was one of the heroes of the original NAFTA debate, and currently serves on the Trade and Environment Policy Advisory Committee of the U.S. government, growing out of some work he previously did on environment in NAFTA. He will be chairing the next session. I will leave it to him to do the real introductions. I'll just say I'm very pleased to have leading off and as the basis for the next section, Professor Lindsay Odensky from Georgetown, who's been with us the last few months and will be ideally forevermore as a non-resident senior fellow here at the Institute. So thank you very much. Jeff?
Thank you, Adam. It'll be hard to top the first panel, but we have a lineup for the second panel that is up to the task. And the focus of the second panel, as Adam said, will be a little more on the small part of NAFTA that accounts for 85% of the combined GDP of the North American region, the United States, but also the interlinkages in the manufacturing sector of the United States and Mexico. And for those of us who remember 20 years ago in the rather fractious debates here and the criticisms about the giant sucking sound of American workers and firms moving to Mexico and hollowing out U.S. manufacturing, it's worthwhile to look at the evidence. And to do that this morning, we start off with Lindsay Odensky. As Adam said, she's a non-resident senior fellow at Peterson, and we've been very pleased to have her as a colleague for almost a year now. And she is also an assistant professor of international economics at Georgetown in the School of Foreign Service. And previously, she has taught at Johns Hopkins, at SAIS, and at California State University in San Marcos. And she's also worked at the U.S. Department of the Treasury, which many of us here regard as a great distinction on her resume, and at the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston, where other people regard that as a great distinction on her resume, and as a consultant in the biotech industry, which I think is very useful to have a private sector perspective in doing the important academic research that she has been doing, focusing on international trade and multinational organizations. At the Institute, she has co-authored two very important studies that were published last year. Outward foreign direct investment and U.S. exports, jobs, and R&D, implications for U.S. trade policy, and foreign direct investment in the United States, benefits, suspicions, and risks with special attention to FDI from China. She has a PhD in economics from the University of California at San Diego, a master's at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, and a BA from Guilford College. So let me start off with Lindsay, and then I will introduce, after her presentation, the two discussants. Thank you. Lindsay.
Okay, thanks, Jeff. So today I'll be talking about the U.S. manufacturing sector since NAFTA, and more specifically, I'll be looking at foreign direct investment by U.S. firms in Mexico and asking, well, whether this has mostly helped or mostly hurt U.S. workers. So in his welcoming remarks, Adam was talking about NAFTA being used as a dirty word in a lot of contexts, and here are just a few of examples of policymakers who have done that and who have expressed fears that U.S. firms opening plants in other countries in general, and Mexico in particular, that fears that that might have some negative effects on U.S. workers. So Ross Perot famously claimed that NAFTA was going to create this giant sucking sound as U.S. jobs and U.S. investment just couldn't resist the pull of lower costs and lower wages south of the border. Then in 2004, John Kerry, when he was running for president, was speaking much more generally, but he criticized U.S. firms that invest abroad as being Benedict Arnold CEOs. And so for those of you who are rusty on U.S. history, Benedict Arnold was a traitor to the U.S. government during the U.S. Revolutionary War. So really saying if you're a U.S. firm and you're opening up operations abroad, that you're somehow a traitor to your own country. And even today, President Obama has really been emphasizing what's known as reshoring initiatives, or he's encouraging U.S. multinationals to either scale back or shut down international operations and to move those to U.S. soil. So what I'm going to look at today is what are some of the facts behind this? What has been happening in U.S. manufacturing, and how does that relate to foreign direct investment by U.S. firms in general and foreign direct investment in Mexico in particular? So it is true that U.S. manufacturing employment has fallen over the past few decades, and even longer than that. In the 1960s, almost 30% of the U.S. workforce was employed in manufacturing. Today, it's less than 10%. However, over the same time period, productivity in U.S. manufacturing has been growing very, very rapidly. And we know these two things have been happening, but there's any number of causes for these, or any number of contributing factors, including technology growth, changes in demand, recessions, booms, globalization may play a role as well. And so what I've done in recent work for Peterson with my co-author Ted Moran, who unfortunately couldn't be here today, is to isolate what the impact of foreign direct investment is, aside from all of those other factors that have been going on at the same time, and try to figure out what the contribution is to offshoring in general, and in particular offshoring to Mexico by U.S. firms on the U.S. manufacturing sector. So most of what I'm going to talk about today is going to be based on a recent Peterson policy brief with Ted Moran, the U.S. manufacturing base 4 signs of strength. So in that policy brief, we look at trends in U.S. manufacturing in general and then link them to total global expansion by U.S. firms. But for today's event, we've done a few updates that are Mexico-specific, where we're going to be looking specifically at U.S. firms that invest in Mexico and what that means for their domestic operations. So one of the key questions here is whether these global operations of U.S. firms in the U.S. and in Mexico or other countries are primarily complementary to each other, or whether they primarily substitute for each other. So you can imagine at least 3 different scenarios. So the first one is what Perot and Kerry and Obama and a number of others have in mind when they're fearing for U.S. jobs. This is kind of the zero-sum game mindset, that U.S. firms have some fixed number of jobs, and they can fill those with workers in the U.S., or they can fill those with workers in other countries. And in this case, there's just pure substitution, and that's where these motivations for shutting down foreign direct investment or reducing it come from. It's also possible that these two things don't affect each other, that firms perfectly segment their global markets. That's unlikely to be the case with the global economy and vertically integrated supply chains, but it's a possibility. And then finally, case 3 is the case of complementarities. And this is the case where firms are strategic in their global operations, and there's reasons that they're opening these affiliates or these plants abroad other than just low wages or purely shifting operations from one place to another. So in this case, there's productivity benefits, perhaps entry opportunities in new markets, new sales, way to capture global market share, and so forth. And in this case, this global expansion actually helps firms to become more productive, more competitive, and hire more workers, both domestically and internationally. And this example would be examples of complementarities. So just to ruin the punchline here, what we find is that case 3 is what dominates. and that if you look at foreign sales, foreign employment, or foreign investment by US firms, that these tend to complement the operations of these firms domestically. So, of course, this doesn't mean that there's no churning. We know there's a tremendous amount of churning, that some plants close, others open, some workers lose their jobs, others gain. That's very important. That's not the topic of this talk today. That's something that Peterson is working on in a number of other projects. But today, what I want to just focus on is the absolute result, just the net result. Which force is larger, the productivity and efficiency gains or these substitution effects? And what we find is that it's the productivity gains and the complementarities that are larger. So before I go into the details of the analysis we do, I just want to set the stage a little bit on US manufacturing and what's been happening over the last decades. So you can see here under the first column for employment, from 1960 to 1979, there was on average, there was annual positive productivity growth in manufacturing employment, but it was much smaller than the total for the overall US economy. But then as you moved into the 1980s, 90s, and 2000s, the average annual growth in US manufacturing employment was actually negative, particularly in the 2000 to 2010 decade there, although a lot of that was driven by first the technology bubble bursting and then the financial crisis. But then we do see some recovery in employment in 2010, 2013, but still not quite as much in manufacturing as for employment in the economy as a whole. But then if you look at output in manufacturing, the picture looks a lot better. You see generally positive with the exception of recession years, and actually in the past few years, manufacturing output growth in the US has been faster than growth in the overall economy. And if you look at output per worker, the manufacturing sector is doing relatively even much better and showing much faster average annual growth compared to the economy as a whole. Now, it's been suggested by some people that this perhaps maybe the productivity growth in manufacturing isn't as positive as you might think, that perhaps it's just being driven by one sector in particular, which is the computer producing sector. And this happens because when we're looking at real output, if you have tremendous falls in the cost per unit of computing power as computers become faster and faster, that this might sort of skew the entire results just because of that one sector. So we broke down these are the top 15 sectors in terms of productivity growth from 1988 to 2011, and then broke it down into even smaller time periods within that. And hopefully you can see this up here, but it's the highest over the 1988 through 2011 period. The subsector with the highest growth was semiconductors and electronic components. Computers were second, but there were a number of other industries that had tremendous growth as well, including transportation equipment, medical equipment, construction machinery, and so forth. And if you look from the growth in 2010 and 2011, it was actually negative for the computing sector, and it was a number of other sectors, including motor vehicles, industrial machinery, and so forth, that were really driving this growth. So this is something that's more widespread. It's not just falls in computing power driving U.S. manufacturing productivity. There's a lot more going on behind the story there. And then if you compare the U.S. relative to the rest of the world, productivity growth in the past 2 years post-recession was actually quite high. Average annual manufacturing value-added growth as a share of GDP was 2.19% in the US, which was much higher than the world average, which was slightly negative, and it was pretty good compared to other countries. You can see up there Germany's an outlier, so clearly they're doing well at a number of things, not just football, but then you've got Japan and you've got a couple of other countries doing quite well. And that's skewing the high-income OECD European Union numbers. If you look country by country, you can see the US growth was much higher than the UK and France in the past few years. And if you notice Mexico up there actually doing well relative to some of the other emerging market countries. If you've got China and India. So how do these things relate to each other? How does this manufacturing picture and the changes in growth and in productivity over the last years in the US relate to Mexico, and specifically investments by US firms in Mexico? Well, obviously, as we all know, the two countries are very closely linked. In terms of foreign direct investment, in 2012, Mexico was the 23rd largest recipient in the world for foreign direct investment. So there were 22 other countries receiving more FDI than Mexico. But for the US, it was just barely missed making the top 10 in terms of destinations for US foreign direct investment. And the volumes were quite large. So in 2011, which is the most recent year for which we have this kind of detailed data, you can see that affiliates of US firms in Mexico sold about $252 billion of goods and services. So these are sales originating in Mexico at affiliates of US-owned multinational companies, and those affiliates employed 1.3 million Mexican workers. So the question that we're going to look at, and that was raised and has been raised by a number of policymakers, is whether this is good or bad for the US. So we've done extensive work on this, my colleague Ted Moran and I, and we've started by looking at all US multinationals using very detailed data over a 20-year period, micro-level firm data, and have found that in aggregate, expansion abroad by US firms is associated with greater sales, greater employment, greater R&D spending by these firms, not just worldwide, but also in the US because of the productivity gains it gives them, because of these efficiency effects that allow them to become much larger, expand much more quickly, and get larger market shares. And so now I'll show that we've repeated that exercise looking just at firms that invest in Mexico to show this isn't these aggregate international results. So they're not being driven by Germany or Japan or anything like this. These are true also when we look specifically at foreign direct investment by US firms in Mexico. So in other words, when you actually look at the data, we didn't actually hear this giant sucking sound, and perhaps these CEOs of these firms are not quite Benedict Arnolds. So when we're looking at the methodology, it's important to just take a moment to talk about the kind of firm level analysis that we do. Because if you just look at the aggregate data and say, oh, well, US manufacturing employment has been falling. We also know that NAFTA was signed, and there's a correlation between these two things. Well, you don't know that, right? There's so many other things that have been going on in the world at the same time. Which is why it's important to look in more detail, especially because if you look within US manufacturing and compare the firms that are multinationals to the firms that are not, it's the multinationals that are performing much, much better. It's the US firms that do have these operations abroad, that are investing outwardly and that are going global, that actually have much, much stronger employment growth than the manufacturing sector as a whole, which in itself is suggestive evidence that it is not a causal substitution relationship between foreign investment and domestic investment. But again, we look in much more detail beyond just looking at this aggregate data. And so in doing this, as I mentioned, we use this wonderful firm level data available at the US Bureau of Economic Analysis on all US multinationals since the late 1980s. And we use a number of econometric techniques. We control for firm level fixed effects. We're able to control for the fact that there's these industry patterns, there's idiosyncratic issues going on in any one of these firms at any given time. And then controlling for, because it's panel data, we control for these year effects as well, and the impact of recessions and booms, which is of course very important because we had the Mexican peso crisis right at the beginning of this time period, as well as a number of issues in the US economy. So once you take all of that into account, you include all of those things and just isolate the relationship between the expansion abroad by the US firms and their expansion domestically, you see that the relationship is positive. So this is just a graph showing our regression coefficients from that regression, looking at, this one looks at what happens if you see a 10% increase in employment at affiliates of US firms in Mexico, what's the equivalent change in US domestic employment, sales, R&D, and so forth. And the first thing to note is that these are all positive. And so this is not consistent with the story where firms are just picking up, closing down a plant in Detroit and just moving it to Mexico. If this were happening and you had this pure shifting, you would see a negative relationship. You would see increases in Mexico associated with losses in the US. And we do not see that at all. We see these positive relationships. And you can see it's the largest for US R&D spending. That moving plants to Mexico frees up resources in the US for many, many things, and one of the biggest is some of these higher skilled, higher value activities, such as research and development investment. And then we have some results. I didn't put them up on the slides today, given the short amount of time that I have, but they're in the policy brief. We actually break them down by manufacturing and services parents in the US and manufacturing and services affiliates in Mexico, and see that feedback, when you've got the manufacturing plants in Mexico, it has the largest positive effect on the services, including research, engineering, marketing, and so forth in the US. But it's true for the aggregate as well. And now these are all in percentage terms, but it's important to keep in mind that these US firms have much larger operations in the US than they do in Mexico. So if we're talking about a few percentage points in the US, but still much greater number of sales, much larger employment and so forth in the US relative to Mexico. So just to translate these into some pure numbers instead of just looking at percentages, you can think about, I'll take the employment number, right? And so those results show that the relationship is that for the average US firm, the 10% increase in their operations in in Mexico leads to a 1.3 increase in their employment in the US. And so you consider the average firm in this sample, these are multinational, so these are the largest of all the manufacturing firms, employs about 25,000 workers in the US and about 1,000 in Mexico. And so every 10% increase in employment, that just happens to be the unit that we're using to put some context on this, every 10% increase in employment at affiliates in Mexico, that corresponds to about 131 jobs. So scaling up by that magnitude for the average firm would correspond to an increase in 333 US jobs per firm, right? And so these are, hypotheticals. This is the relationship that exists for the average firm, but you can think about, we use 10% because it's a nice round number, but in any case, that relationship is essentially, one job in Mexico, 2.5 jobs in the US. That's the ratios that we're talking about here in terms of the magnitude of these feedback effects. And of course, these numbers may be offset by other factors. There are plenty of industry trends. There's technology growth that's happening at the same time. There's developments in production techniques. There's changes in demand among US consumers. There's a number of other things going on that can offset this effect of the foreign engagement by US firms. And so, this is holding everything else constant. This is isolating just the relationship between the foreign engagement and the domestic expansion. But then once you put those other things in, some of them may augment, some of them may offset this relationship between foreign investment and domestic investment. But it's very clear that the net impact of investment in Mexico by US firms is positive and not negative. So if you look at the overall trends, if you see these declines in U.S. manufacturing employment, there are many things that are contributing to that, but it cannot be pinned on NAFTA, because the effects of NAFTA, at least the foreign direct investment by U.S. firms in Mexico as a result of NAFTA, that has had a positive effect on U.S. employment, U.S. investment, U.S. research and development, U.S. capital, U.S. sales by these multinational firms. So just to conclude, we've seen this trend of U.S. manufacturing productivity going up over the last few decades while employment is going down. And as I said, this is not due to offshoring to Mexico, because as we can see, this type of offshoring to Mexico has net positive impacts on the U.S. economy.
Thank you, Lindsay, for a very clear and concise presentation, and one that was well within your time frame, so that will leave us more time for questions when we have, after we have heard from our two very distinguished discussants. Our first discussant is Manuel Balmaceda from CEMEX. He is the chief economist at CEMEX, and he's been that for several years. He previously served as chief European economist and other positions at the Banco Bilbao Vizcaya Argentaria. He has been a visiting researcher at the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis and has worked as well and done collaborative work with the IMF. He has a PhD in economics from Northwestern University and a BA in economics from Colby College. So Manuel, the floor is yours.
Hello. First of all, thank you very much to the Peterson Institute for inviting me to share some thoughts on NAFTA and the importance of NAFTA, not only for the US. I will focus also on what the importance has been for Mexico and what can we expect, right? First of all, I was a little surprised when we started discussing, and I saw the paper talking about the impact of NAFTA and trade on employment in the US. And I was, because it was, to me, it was something like innovation, right? Would we care if innovation reduced employment in the short term? We know that that would increase in the midterm, and there would be no discussion whatsoever, right, to the fact that innovation is good, and that in the midterm to long term it actually pays off more than the cost that it might have in the short term, right? And NAFTA or trade is pretty much in the same ballpark. It might have some cost disruptive changes in the short term, but actually, once everything is clear, it has a positive impact. In that context, it took me a while just to get going on how to focus the issue of employment, but there are two things that really come to mind. And the first one is the internationalization of companies. Actually, it is not clear whether they go, and actually I think was put very, very, very clearly before, whether it's the cost decision. It's actually much more of a growth decision. And to the extent that it is a growth decision, right, the fact that you can grow in all markets, your market, even if it's the US market, which is the largest market in the world, it's becomes small. The fact that you can grow elsewhere actually allows you first to diversify risks, and second, and most importantly, also be able to reach a much larger pool of talent. And not only that, but by having a much greater scope or greater scope for markets or larger potential demand, actually that increases the return to things that you do at home, namely research and development, innovation, and diversification of products. Why? Because obviously all products now have a much larger market in which you can sell those products, and second, the new products obviously will have a much larger potential demand. So therefore, it's not strange that companies that actually do well are those that internationalize, and for that reason, first, because they're doing well, they're increasing jobs at home, and that's something I will show, but not only that, the fact that they're international gives them a much greater return to the things that they keep at home. What is obviously clear is that they are not doing at home the same things that they did previously. So we're going to have some type of sectoral shift. Offshoring, you may be offshoring manufacturing production, but on the other hand, you're inshoring, and that's the case in the US, talent, skills, right, from all over the world, and you have run your research and development, and not only research and development, but all other, let's say, corporation functions from the US. And in that context, obviously, for me, it was pretty, it's nice to see because you can argue now with numbers, what previously you would say with jobs reports, but it's clear to see that actually there's a return, positive return to internationalization. My only question is whether you have a selection bias in your sample, if you want the criticism. Why? Because obviously those companies that are internationalized, those companies that go abroad are those that are doing well at home. Therefore, over time, if they were good previously, they will continue to do well, all else equal, ceteris paribus, in the future, and therefore, yeah, they will generate more jobs, but they would have anyways. We don't have the counterfactual, right? My argument would be that now they're increasing even more jobs because now they have potential for larger scope, larger markets, and therefore larger returns. But that's my only other question in that respect. The only worry here is much more of a which as economists we have to attack, is the fact that what we have is a sectoral shift, if you want. Obviously, you are going to be focusing on certain activities that previously you were not. And to that extent, that's where the quote-unquote political cost, if you want, comes, right? Because you are displacing workers, likely you will be displacing workers from some sort of workers to another productions. But that's only, at the end of the day, is growth to the extent that you are increasing the skills of the population as a whole, right? And that's not only, it's nothing bad, actually it's natural and it's good. My only other comment to the US in that context is that it's becoming ever more difficult to distinguish what manufacturing jobs are and what services jobs are, right? If the R&D function is run within the company, that's called manufacturing. If it's not running within the company, it's called services. Well, it's the same thing. Right? They are both the same thing. So what matters is really whether you generate jobs in the economy as a whole, not whether you're generating jobs, particularly in the manufacturing sector or other things. Right? So that would be my comments mainly for the US part. But going a little farther, when one looks at the impact of NAFTA and trade in Mexico, my first worry, I have two worries. The first one is very hard to distinguish or to differentiate because, as Lindsay mentioned, there were too many things happening at the same time. We had a 50% devaluation of the peso, right? We had trade openness everywhere, right? So saying NAFTA did this or NAFTA did that, and a little later, here comes China, right? So these are big players. So saying NAFTA did this or NAFTA did that is a little presumptuous, to say the least. But even so, I can understand criticism in Mexico for NAFTA sometimes. When you look at GDP per capita, right, it hasn't done very well in the last, since 95. As a matter of fact, the growth of Mexico, and we talked about it in the previous panel, has been relatively timid over the last 3 decades, and it has been slower in the last decade. So, in that sense, it's hard to argue that NAFTA did help. When one looks at, say, yeah, but that was Mexico compared to other emerging economies. Well, when you compare to other emerging economies, particularly Latin American economies, it actually didn't do any better than other Latin American economies. Or even it did worse than some of the Asian economies and so on that actually did not have such a push from NAFTA. My counter-argument to that is like, look at the counterfactual. My argument is that probably Mexico would be doing much worse if it hadn't been for NAFTA and for openness. And the second factor, which is where we are at right now, is that trade openness, NAFTA, is only one ingredient in the cocktail of things that you need for growth. It's just a piece of the puzzle. In other words, NAFTA, right now, electricity costs in Mexico for companies are 40% higher than they are in the United States. Right? You can have trade openness, but you have 40% higher electricity costs. That means you're in trouble, right? We talked about informality before, which is probably the most important pending reform in Mexico, is how do we make formality the norm and not the other way around, right? But what we're seeing in Mexico now, and that's why I'm quite optimistic for the future, is that Mexico knew what they had to do, and they have put together a package of reforms, in beginning with energy, labor, financial reform, or whatever, that when you combine all those reforms in the future, down the line, they should add to the fact that you have a very, very open economy to produce growth. Just let me give you a couple of numbers. Before NAFTA, trade openness in Mexico was around 30%, export plus imports over GDP. After NAFTA, it went up to over 60%, 70%, right? So it's a much more open economy. It was unlucky. It opened at the wrong, it opened in 95, and since then we've been in crisis in developed economies. So Mexico emerged right when everybody wanted to be emerging, right? Tough luck. But at the end of the day, Mexico has gained something, two very, very important things from NAFTA that actually are not in the numbers. Or they're in the numbers, but they're not in the real numbers. Let's put it this way. It's not in employment, which obviously is very important, right? And it's not in growth, or at least it's not there yet. But they're very, very important. The first one is institutional framework. The institutional framework, pre-NAFTA and contemporary in Mexico, are two completely different things, right? NAFTA, to that extent, or the integration, I don't know why I keep coming back to NAFTA, it's more than that, right? The integration with the US economy was not just an integration with the US, it was really opening to OECD way of looking at things, which meant that economic policy has been much more sustainable and orthodox in Mexico over the last 15 years. And that is something to look forward, and that is something that will pay back eventually, and I would argue it's already paying back. The second one, I will refer to a work by Hausman at Harvard, Professor Hausman at Harvard, which is about productive knowledge, right? And it compared a lot of countries' productive knowledge, and the idea is that when you are integrated, in particular in manufacturing in the world, and particularly when you have so much foreign direct investment, right, you are able to adopt technologies much more quicker, and not only that, you can spread them to the rest of your economy much faster. And to that extent, Mexico, in the case of Professor Hausman's productive knowledge numbers, come out as one of the leading countries, definitely by a long shot, the leading one in Latin America, but not only that. It's one of the countries that actually, and this is because of NAFTA, because of the foreign direct investment and the investment of international corporations in Mexico, what they have brought along. So in that context, I think the future looks very, very bright. And let me just say a couple more things. I wouldn't be too critical of the last 15 years in Mexico for one reason. The first part of NAFTA led to Mexico specialized mainly in less capital and skill-intensive products. Right? That was the first stage. Over time, that's changing. And now, obviously, somebody mentioned automotives, but it's not automotives, it's auto parts, it's electronics. They're expanding their growth much farther than that. And therefore, that's where the real value added is. And that's where the productivity will come. Because the challenge of Mexico has been generating growth, and generating growth has been a matter of generating productivity. The second question is, Mexico, and this is the question I will try to more or less finish, is will Mexico be able to generate productivity? I said, my argument is yes. So far, in the last 3 decades, the cheap factor of production in Mexico has been labor. It was cheaper than any other factor. Going forward, actually, there is going to be a much more bigger need for capital-intensive production, which is already coming from all international investments, from all FDI, right? And now the question is for Mexico is to what extent can they bring all that, I can't remember now if it was the 1 minus alpha or the alpha part, back into the core, right, and make it part of the solution. That's the challenge. But I think the pieces are there. right? And a lot of what's happened has had to do with NAFTA. I'll end up by saying, you know, I come from Cemex. Cemex is a Mexican multinational. It's probably, if not the largest, one of the largest producers in the US. That's possible because of integration, right? Not only in the US, but in the world. That's possible because of integration. But it has a great advantage of being an international, a multinational, not only for American companies, but also for Mexican companies. We were talking before about this the small pool of talent that might be available when you're in an emerging economy. That's not the case when you grow beyond your borders, because you can tap the pool of talent everywhere you are, and that's what companies do, both American companies and companies like ours. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Manuel. Our second discussant will be Christian Volpe Martinez from the Inter-American Development Bank. Christian has worked previously at the Ministry of the Economy of the province of Buenos Aires and has been an advisor at the Mercosur Commission of the National Representatives Chamber in Argentina. Previously, he was also a researcher at the Center for European Integration Studies in Bonn. He holds a PhD in economics from the University of Bonn and a Master of Economics from the National University of La Plata in Argentina. Christian.
Okay, good morning. Thank you for the invitation to the Peter Institute, to Barbara in particular. I'm glad to be here to discuss this policy brief that were written by Lindsay and Ted. And we'll talk about American manufacturing mostly in this discussion. And this is what we will talk about. I will briefly summarize what Lindsay was saying before, and then we will talk about whether the US manufacturing is anomalous or not, and then we will see what I mean by that. Then I have some questions, as usual. As a discussion, you have questions. Then we'll talk about evidence from other countries about the relationship between offshoring and domestic economic activities. Then more questions, and finally some discussion on the policy recommendations. So let's start with the summary of Lindsay's and Ted's works. And basically, they have a very interesting, well-written, and solid policy brief where they show four stylized facts pointing to the strengths of the US manufacturing sector in recent years. First is the growth in real value added in manufacturing and the growth in labor productivity. They were steadily growing in previous decades in recent years. Second one is US manufacturing seems to be growing faster than in other sectors in recent years. And US manufacturing also appears to be growing faster than counterparts in other parts of the world. So that's the three main stylized facts that correspond to what Lindsay was referring to the setting the stage. And then the one she focused on in her presentation is the last one, which is the increased offshoring in manufacturing is associated with increased domestic activity, particularly in R&D. And this holds in general, regardless of where companies are outsourcing, but also in particular for the case of Mexico. Now, and the authors conclude that policies aim at restricting the movement of companies or the internationalization of companies are misguided, and in contrast, those strengthening economic fundamentals, acting on education, infrastructure, and so on, are the ones that should be pursued. So let's start about they have a very nice discussion at the beginning about currency policy discussion, about the strengths or weakness of US manufacturing sector. And then that makes me remember when you go to the pediatrician, yeah, it's like you go to the pediatrician. Some of us are still going to pediatricians. Some of you probably went in the past. But one of the things that pediatrician provide you is a chart where tells you where your kid is located in terms of the distribution of height and weight. Yeah, and they say, well, he or she is growing fine. It's above the median, or it's about the median, and then you are relaxed. So everything is going well. And in particular, when you talk about the weight, you always have to compare with the height of the kit. I mean, the kit is high, the weight is higher. So that's basically the kind of exercise we have here, where we relate share of manufacturing value added in country GDP and the GDP per capita. So we are relating how big is the manufacturing sector in relationship to the level of development of the country. So what do we mean by anomalies? This is the US kind of out of the line, is not aligned with the expectations. And what you see, regardless of where the year we look at, in 2000 or 2011, that the US is exactly on the curve. So the size of the sector is exactly what you would expect according to the level of development of the country. So the second question would be, well, did it behave anomalously over recent years? And the answer is, again, no. But here what you do is you relate the change in the relative size of US manufacturing, so the change in the share of US manufacturing value added in GDP with the initial level of GDP per capita, so in the initial level of the development of the country. And what you see, again, the US exactly is on the curve. So there is nothing strange on that. It's perfectly according to expectations. Now, what this boils down is to the point that US manufacturing has a size and behaves according to expectations. That's exactly what the authors were saying. And the evidence they provide is quite robust. Now, I have some questions on the figures, though, that makes us kind of put them into context. First one is, when you compare periods, you have decade, 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 and then 2 years, or 3 years, whatever. The question is, well, is recent performance sustainable over longer time periods, so we can expect these figures to remain until the end of the decade? To what extent can they consider reaction to the preceding downturn? In the same vein, when you talk about manufacturing is expanding faster than total non-farm business economy, when you look at the previous decade, the non-farm economy didn't contract, but does happen with manufacturing. So to what extent this diverging growth rates will remain or will converge? That's the kind of a question you as a discussant are able to do. The questions that probably don't have any answer, and you can provide me with an answer, but that's the role of the referee, to raise that question. And the same one, the last one is, and I will show you a graph about that. In the same way, when you compare it to other countries, it can be helpful to see not only what happened after the crisis, but also before the crisis. So if you see that in that case, you see, of course, the US is one of the countries experienced larger growth in recent years, but when you go backwards, it's one of the countries that experienced the largest contractions in the share of, this is exactly what you have in your corresponding graph, is the share of manufacturing in GDP, the annual percentage change in the share of manufacturing in GDP in those periods. Now, the good thing about the analysis is that, again, the US is not alone in this positive relationship between offshoring and domestic economic activities. There are several papers talking about other countries, looking at the experience of other countries, like France, Germany, Italy, and Japan, where authors clearly show that if there is a relationship, there is a positive relationship. So you expand abroad, and then there are positive effects at home. Now, the evidence presented by the author is compelling. Some issues, and including those technical, and again, I do research, so I will have some technical issues to discuss with you. I will do my best to convince you that this is important. It's important to say the order of magnitude of the relationship. It's not about the relation because I'm convinced by what they are doing. But the first one is, can the result be mechanically extrapolated to the entire economy? And probably the answer is, well, it depends. Do we have cross effects or not? So what do I mean by cross effects? So if you are a company offshoring something, are you affecting other companies? In the relationship they are looking at the relationship. I'm a company offshoring something. So that has a positive effect on my own activity at home. What happened with other companies, say with providers? If you offshore, could affect your providers. So if you stop sourcing from your provider at home, probably they will have less demand, it could affect jobs, something like that. We don't know, But again, evidence on Japan suggests that this is not the case. So if we should be concerned, can we concern about, well, we don't know, but probably not. It shouldn't be kind of a second order magnitude effect, if any. Then the other thing is, and this is also related to the exercise they do with Mexico, and that's very interesting, because if you compare the numbers, the message is exactly the same. Regardless of you look at all destinations or just look at Mexico, there is a positive relationship between offshoring and domestic economic activity. Now, the question then, when I was looking at the estimations, one of the things that came to my mind is, well, are results conditional on the sector of activity? Because Lindsay itself was saying, well, this is overall, so we are pulling together firms operating in all kinds of sectors, but probably in one sector the relationship will be stronger than in others, depending on the nature of the sector. Or could be the case that the effects is conditional on the destination where you are offshoring. Say, for example, if you have a trade agreement, and the trade agreement addresses not only tariff, but other aspects of the bilateral relationship, then there are, say, less barriers in general, and then what you do abroad will have a positive impact, a stronger positive impact than what you do at home. Could be the case, we don't know, but probably something that is worth exploring. And well, again, and there could be a difference depending on what kind of FDI you do. It's horizontal, it's vertical, so it's in the same sector, it's in a sector that provides inputs. And of course, again, I was saying that I do research, so I have one technical comment. It's not only sample selection, it could be endogeneity, and that's very unfair from my side. It's always the case. When you do empirical research, you always say, there is an endogeneity problem. What's an endogeneity problem? And let me tell you like that. It's like, did you see the game last Sunday? Well, I suffered the game. I'm from Argentina, so I didn't see the game. I suffered the game. In the end, I accept the result. But it's like that. So was 1-0, yeah? And then you can always say, well, it depends. What's the explanation? Well, the Argentinian defense was very strong. Well, that could be one explanation. The other one, German attack played very bad. That's one explanation. The explanation is, no. Well, the German attack played well and the Argentinian played well. But they neutralize each other. Or you can say, so you can say also, on the other hand, so you don't know what's behind the results. Was the Argentinian defense very good, or the German attack very bad? So you don't know what's the explanation. And here is something like that. You don't know whether this is offshoring that leads to more domestic activities, or there is some more domestic activities leading to more offshoring, or there is something else. There is something else explaining both of them, say, and something that we don't observe. For example, the other day, you can say the weather. That thing that we didn't see was the weather. So Argentinian players are more accustomed to play with hot weather, and Germans not, and that's the reason of this tight game. So it could be the case. I don't know. And the other thing, is how you confident are with the data you have. If you are liberal, they will say, well, no, I mean, all the data we have, it's definitely usable. Otherwise, you can say, well, no, I'm more conservative. There is not too much variation in the data. And then could be a matter of clustering standard errors. So let me conclude by talking about the policy recommendations. What the author rightfully conclude is that introducing restrictions to movement of companies could be bad, could be really not the best way to go. Capital is mobile, and if you ask people not to move, people will not enter into business in the first time. Improving the fundamentals, on the other hand, is likely to have high payoff. And there are examples of this view even in recent US programs, even in the National Export Initiative in 2011, and something more even very recent, which is the Single Window Initiative in 2014, you see there actions. So this line of reasoning towards we have to simplify the way of doing business. We have to simplify life for companies. Companies have to do business very easily, and that's to improvement of business climate. And just and we are currently doing at the IDB some research on this kind of trade facilitation initiatives, including single windows. And one last word about trade agreements. Of course, there are thousands of possible factors affecting trade, and it could be presumptuous to say, well, trade agreements, and in particular NAFTA, has a positive impact on trade. But there are some studies showing that trade agreements tend to increase trade. And also, we have a recent study showing that trade agreements favor offshoring. And you know what Lindsay just showed you. This offshoring is positively associated with domestic economic activity. So in the end, what you have here is that these trade agreements like NAFTA are likely to play an important role in strengthening economic activities at home. And just two last figures. This is one on total manufacturing export, US manufacturing exports. And this is manufacturing export to Mexico that increased a lot in recent years and become a more important trading partner. And this is about the number of subsidiaries of US companies in Mexico and in other countries in which the US hasn't a trade agreement, which is Brazil. What you see is, of course, there is some kind of anticipation, and again, we can talk about causality because it's a bilateral comparison, but what you see is that the US has increased significantly the number of subsidiaries in Mexico, and this led to an expansion of activities there, and again, by the results that Lindsay showed you, it has positively affects economic activities here in the US. Thank you very much for your attention.
Well, first let me say thank you very much to Lindsay for providing such a substantive presentation and a source for very extensive comments from Manuel and Christian. Let me also say my regrets to Christian that Argentina was not the only country that lost 1-0 to Germany. The United States had the bad fortune of having to lose in an earlier round, but still the same result. I would like to start our discussion, and then I will quickly turn to questions from the audience. But drawing on some of the themes from the discussant comments, the data that's been presented shows pretty strongly that in the aggregate, there is a very positive effect on the U.S. economy and on U.S. manufacturing. But if you listen to the NAFTA debate in the United States, for 20 years, it's been driven quite importantly by a few sectors. And if you look at our trade with Mexico, it is dominated by trade in the auto sector. And so I wonder, Lindsay, if I could ask you to start off with a comment on, is part of the concern about NAFTA and manufacturing driven by the auto sector, and does the results show really that these concerns have been exaggerated, and perhaps you can start from there.
Oh, certainly. Yeah, and if you look at the data on both sides of the border, you could make the case in opposite directions, right? So if you look at, what's the largest sector for foreign direct investment by U.S. firms in Mexico, it's transportation, and that primarily means automobiles, automobile parts, and so forth. And so I think that's what's fueling a lot of those fears. But at the same time, if you look at U.S. productivity growth and where that's been concentrated within the U.S., the automobile sector is one of the strongest sectors in terms of productivity growth in the U.S. as well. And so I think that that's certainly a sector that gets a lot of attention because it's so large. But I think pinning sort of these negative concerns about U.S. manufacturing on NAFTA is certainly misguided. And I think part of that is related to one of, I think, the really important points that Manuel made, which is when you're thinking about what is a manufacturing job in the U.S. And in terms of, for instance, the U.S. automobile sector, is it necessarily assembly line work, or is it designing the next generation of electric cars or something like that? And I think there's certainly concerns there, but if you look at the big picture and you look at the broader manufacturing, not just assembly within automobiles, but look at the automobile sector and others that are becoming more intensive in R&D and creating jobs there, it looks a little bit different.
Manuel, Christian, do you want to add anything to that, or she said it pretty well? Let me open the floor to questions from the audience so we have plenty of time. We'll start with the gentleman in the back and then Anne. Please identify yourself and your affiliation.
Yeah, hi, I'm Barry Solars. I'm here representing Nucor, which is the largest steel producer in the United States. Well, first I'd like to compliment the Institute for this focus on not only on Mexico, but on manufacturing in particular. In that regard, one data point that kind of stuck out was Germany, which was described as an outlier. Although I've seen some of the research on the German example, I think probably more could be done in that area. And Adam, it might be something that the Institute would want to look at, how such a high-wage, highly regulated economy such as Germany can be doing as well as it's doing with manufacturing as a percent of GDP. In terms of this offshoring discussion, I guess I'd like to use steel as an example and then also kind of pose a question, because the assumption that I think all of you are making, and I agree with many of the points that were made, in particular the points made by Dr. Balmaceda about you can't look at just the words written in the agreement. NAFTA, to me, is much more than the words in an agreement. It's the concept involves the logistics of North America and the extent to which we have or have not been taking full advantage of the natural synergies that exist in North America, and of course now, in particular, in the energy area. But logistics in terms of transportation, et cetera, the so-called natural market, what one can ship by rail, by truck, by barge, whatever, as opposed to offshoring in a global context. If I can use steel as an example, and then I'll pose a question. The United States...
Please try to make it very concise.
The United States is currently running a significant direct steel trade surplus with Mexico, and it's running a significant indirect steel deficit with Mexico. That gets to your automotive point. But in terms of all of those imports, automotive related and appliances and other things, steel containing goods from Mexico, there's a lot of U.S. steel that goes into those steel containing goods that are imported back into the United States. That's not necessarily the case when we import steel containing goods from, say, China. So, again, my question is all offshoring equally beneficial? Or is, for example, offshoring, quote unquote, in a region such as North America perhaps more beneficial in the strengthening of the NAFTA supply chain than offshoring in a more global context? And of course that also pertains to the upcoming discussion on the TPP, where rule of origin is now going to involve a value from any one of 12 countries, not just 3.
It's actually a very short question.
Yes. No, I could say more than that. Yeah, so I mean, obviously what I've shown is primarily aggregate results, and there's a lot of heterogeneity among sectors and among countries. But when we've done this exercise, not just with Mexico, but looking at China and looking at other countries, the productivity effects and the positive benefits and the complementarities are there. And it might not necessarily, you know, I'm not an expert on steel itself, but for example, you give the case of China, and think about the iPhone. It's such a small fraction of the value added in that phone comes from China, and the majority of that occurs to the US. And so, you know, yes, there's going to be variation within sectors across different countries, but we see these types of positive feedbacks everywhere.
Very quickly, I agree completely. I guess offshoring is pretty much all the same. The question is, you may not be exporting an intermediate good to the country which you are importing back. You might be exporting something else. It's a matter of specialization. It's more a question of integration, and not only integration, economic integration, but also integration in the regulatory framework that makes those things much more flexible and beneficial to both sides.
Yes, no, I also fully agree. I mean, there is a lot of, that was one of the points even in the discussion. So there is maybe a lot of heterogeneity across sectors and even destinations. Now, in general, seems to be the case that the relationship is positive and, of course, can vary according to not only the integration of the regulatory frameworks, whether the trade barriers are low or tariff barriers are low, but also the integration. So how well connected are the countries in terms of physical infrastructure?
Thank you. Anne?
Thank you. Very interesting paper. Thank you very much. At the beginning, Lindsay, you pointed to 3 routes: positive, negative, neutral. I think actually there's a 4th route that is part of what your positive would be that you didn't highlight, and I've never seen any work done on it, but I suspect it's important, and that is that firms in the United States, with value-added chains, firms in the United States are competing with firms in Europe and firms in Asia and so on and so forth, which have their own value-added chains. To the extent that Mexico is a source for American firms, that's closer because of transport and so on, and I've seen some numbers saying it is. Then, of course, you get another effect, namely some firms that otherwise could not expand or could not expand as much or as profitably can do so as long as they offshore some of the items that are more expensive to produce here. And if we didn't have offshoring as the alternative within NAFTA that it is, it's conceivable, or likely, I don't know which, that, for example, Japanese firms that are offshoring in Vietnam would have a greater competitive advantage or less disadvantage than they now have. And yet this seems never to be mentioned. What we don't notice is the firms that didn't go out of business and might have done so had there not been offshoring.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think that's a great point. And that's something, here we don't look at market share relative to firms headquartered in other countries, but that's a really good point, and I think that's something that could be looked at and should be paid more attention to, and in addition to the benefits just for the firms themselves. Yeah, thank you.
Sherman Robinson at IFPRI. I'd like to follow up on Anne's point. You see, the outsourcing point, which Manuel made, is a very important part of that. And when a firm outsources its personnel office or something, it'll show up as total factor productivity growth of the firm that's doing the outsourcing. In the case of the U.S.-Mexico manufacturing, you're looking at an enormous amount of the trade, which you noted is intra-firm. But you're seeing the outsourcing is offshoring, and you will show it up as a TFP growth. The point to make, though, is you're really focusing just on manufacturing, and you're missing that the value chains we're seeing around the world are much broader than that. They're services, they're agriculture, as well as manufacturing. In fact, the services, part of this growth manufacturing may show is when you outsource the services, they disappear from the manufacturing, they show up as services trade, and you're not counting them that way. The question for Mexico is it taking part in these international value chains other than with the U.S.? It's enormously important with its U.S. trade. is this a major source for potential growth for Mexico elsewhere?
I'll take the second part primarily. I mean, no, Mexico is mainly integrated in the U.S. manufacturing value chain. It has very important links and growing links with some parts of Europe, right? As you mentioned, it is true in manufacturing is with the U.S., but for example, in financial services, it's actually much more linked to European banks, particularly Spanish banks, than to the U.S. banks. So at the end of the day, it's much more of integration in the global economy. Obviously, manufacturing U.S. it makes sense. Transport cost, regulations, there are a lot of factors, right? But the fact that it's worth for Mexico is something we'll discuss later. Is that I always say that the proof is in the pudding. The fact that Mexico is one of the countries pushing forward for the Asian, Asian Pacifico, Tratado Asia Pacifico. I don't know what the name is in English, so sorry about that. The Asian Pacific Treaty with Chile, Colombia, Peru, and Mexico, it means that they are seeing a lot of value for them in this process. And actually, it's kind of interesting. And are these countries the ones that are pushing forward with new trade openness let's say, policies instead of the traditional developed economies who used the ones that used to do it?
Listen, I can't speak so much to Mexico's integration with countries other than the U.S., but I can say a bit about the services piece. And I actually have done quite a bit of research on this outside of this particular policy brief and the talk today. And you see that that's absolutely crucial. And that's one of the big questions here is as trade and services keeps increasing, where do you draw the line between services and manufacturing? And this is something that Brad Jensen here at the Institute has been working on, and Andy Bernard at Dartmouth has been actually trying to reclassify a lot of activities that are not in the data classified as manufacturing, but saying if we look at what's actually supporting manufacturing industries, you find that manufacturing productivity growth and employment in the U.S. is even stronger than you would think. So we certainly see evidence of that and the role of services.
Dan first.
Thank you. Dan Griswold, President of the National Association of Foreign Trade Zones. I have a question for Dr. Oldensky. Great study, by the way. I hope it gets wide circulation. But my question is, to what extent can you reverse engineer your correlations? Let's say the president, through his bully pulpit in Congress, threatening legislation, companies are sort of shamed into bringing jobs back to the United States. And let's just say some company X has 131 jobs in Mexico and they bring them back to the United States. To what extent does that plausibly put in jeopardy 333 jobs here in the United States?
Right, so we haven't actually done that analysis, but that is something that I'm sort of working on next, is this reshoring initiative. And this is something that's so new, it's hard to really look at what the data say. But I think that what we can confidently say is that given that there are these positive relationships, that restricting investment or attempting to reverse investment will have negative effects. So again, we haven't exactly quantified those yet, but there's certainly that would definitely have a negative effect.
Thank you, Eduardo Medina Mora, Ambassador of Mexico. But 20 years ago, a part of the NAFTA negotiating team from the private sector, not the government. And back then, in the private sector, we were not very happy with the idea of NAFTA because we were certain of what was going to put at risk and not very certain of the gains. But essentially, the conversation that moved forward NAFTA from the Mexican private sector perspective was two things. First, the macroeconomic institutional framework to get rid of the nonsensical, at least some of it, macroeconomic approach, which we actually did. We actually achieved macroeconomic stability, and today is considered a given, but back then some of us were discussing to adopt the dollar as the currency of the land because there was no hope. Well, there is hope, and certainly if you apply sound macroeconomic, monetary and fiscal policies well aligned among them, you can get some results. But the issue was really behind everything for US firms and Mexican firms that actually drove the political basis for NAFTA to move forward was to enhance the competitiveness of the region, which was really read as to enhance the competitiveness of firms operating in the region. And this is not 20 years after about trade. This is about shared production. This is more effectively integrated, and the value added from the US into Mexican exports and the role that Mexico plays as a customer for the US in terms of US exports is not accidental. It's really total cost to market, which is much better for US and Mexican firms actually getting into the market here in the US, in Mexico, and vis-a-vis other countries. At the end, the challenge, going backwards to the first panel, is this trade, which is very successful, is essentially carried out through 200 firms. And it's not being democratized in terms of how it unfolds down in the US and in Mexico. And this is the real challenge. How, without affecting this very successful part of the Mexican economy, which is very much linked to the US, we actually bring up the other players, the small and medium-sized enterprises, and to see what are the barriers there that have to be removed, what are the incentives to be created. And I'm sorry that this is a comment, not a question.
No, but a very, very valuable contribution and summary of some of the themes from this morning's discussions in both panels. We've reached the time before lunch that I have to call on President Posen for a final question or comment.
We do have a couple more minutes. I was letting everyone else go first, but I mean, this is sensational work. But let me turn for a moment to Christian, who gave us such a good discussion bridging the academic research and the policy. Could I ask you from your seat, both as an experienced person involved with Mercosur and at the IADB, to think a bit for us out loud about how different some of these other countries in Mexico, in Latin America have been. You started that with your picture of Mexico and Brazil. Barbara Kochwar and others in this building have pointed out that Mercosur has been going in a less than salutary direction lately. How have you seen this play out in some of the other countries that did not do this kind of deep integration or did not get the opportunity? Obviously, there were those like Peru and Colombia, which we'll return to later, who did get the opportunity to integrate with the US. But is that reflect differences in this trade and investment pattern that matter?
Yeah, I think you put it very clearly. I mean, there are two kind of groups of countries moving in different directions regarding integration with the world economy. So some countries are more reluctant, some countries are more open, and some of them were mentioned here, like say Chile, Mexico, Peru, Colombia are pushing toward integration even with Asia, with Europe. They have already agreements with the US. So some other countries don't, and we all know the positive impacts of trade in terms of productivity, in terms of growth for the countries, and you see the numbers. So if you are integrated, then you have a lot of benefits to take advantage of, not only in terms of variety of goods you can access, but also in terms of what are the ideas, the goods that firms can use to produce their own goods. So definitely there are different patterns, and again, one could be very presumptuous to say that it's everything about trade, but trade definitely played a role in the difference you see in terms of the results in terms of the things that lead to those results, like investment, for example. It's completely different, the kind of investments that different countries get, depending on what kind of attitude the countries have in relationship to the world economy. It's not only about tariffs. When I'm talking about integration, it's about what is currently being discussed in the Trans-Pacific Alliance, for example, or the Transatlantic Economic Partnership. It's about all other barriers that are key for investment, for integration of global value chains, integration, participation into global value chains, like regulatory frameworks and these kind of issues.
Thank you very much, Christian. And indeed, after the lunch session, we'll have a session to talk about the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the Pacific Alliance, and can build on the comments that you just made. So it just remains for me to thank very much Lindsay Oldensky for an excellent paper and presentation, and Manuel and Christian for very insightful comments that have spurred our discussion. Thank you very much.